Welcome to Curious and Unqualified, a podcast about life in academia. I'm Eric Edlund, professor of physics.
I'm Jeremy Jimenez, professor in the Foundations and Social Advocacy Department. So, here we are, episode 10 of our first season of Curious and Unqualified. What do you think of the season thus far?
I'm very happy with what we've accomplished. It hasn't been easy. It's been a lot of late nights tacking this on top of all the other work that we have to do.
Even with our minimal preparation, it still is a lot of work to do.
One place I'll say a point of improvement is that we are definitely umming less as the season has gone on.
Yes, although you wouldn't know that because we're systematically eliminating 90% of them.
Yes, right. And so that's part of the reason for
We got the first one right there. It was kind of it wasn't exactly an
Well, maybe we'll cut this part out. Before we get into what I think about things, I wanted to address one thing from the last podcast that we posted that was probably very unclear to some of our listeners. And at the beginning of episode 9, you and I had a little banter back and forth about, is this episode 5? Is it 7? Is it episode 1? And the history there is that episode, if you were paying attention, was recorded in January 2024, so about a year and a half ago. And this happened because we have been trying to get this podcast off the ground for about 2.5 years now.
Yeah.
And there's been a number of setbacks along the way. And this podcast actually started out as a trio. I think maybe it's safe to say that we had to abandon that path.
Yeah, and so we kind of had it originally that we were going to have the hard science person, the social science person, me, and the artist. And then, when this colleague left, I kind of put a pause on things. And then we recorded here and there. But I think one of the reasons and perhaps we were very excited to get this started is what's happening now in this country was like we didn't want to dilly-dally any longer with like getting out there these major issues impacting higher education and limitations on free speech. It was time to stop delaying and actually get this ball rolling.
I think we talked about this briefly before, but there was some doubt that we had about whether this was the right time to do it. And I think we both felt it was, but we're also had some reticence about diving into this at this moment because it seems like part of what we're doing is probing the virtues and we might say the failures or shortcomings of higher ed. And that seems like maybe a thing that might be unwelcome at a time when higher ed is receiving lots of scrutiny from all around. But my particular view on that is that part of the reason that is happening is that I don't think higher ed has been great about being honest and self-reflective about its shortcomings. And we need more of these kinds of conversations. And let's be honest, there is a large portion of the population that doesn't trust higher ed and academics. And I think what we need to do is start having conversations that are honest and transparent and inclusive of many different diverse views, even those that are skeptical of higher ed.
Yeah, and though some colleagues had suggested this is the worst time to do it because it's basically kicking an institution while it's down, and whereas a lot of the shortcomings predate Trump, and we would find fair criticisms, a lot of now it's being levied against universities and grants being canceled and people being fired and people deported is completely unjustified. So it's tricky timing in the sense that we wanted to be able to speak about these issues, but at the same time, it's putting ourselves more at risk by putting us on the radar. And in general, right, it might be giving more fire to unfair critiques that are more recent due to the Trump administration, as opposed to more ongoing shortcomings that, higher education and its staff and faculty might have not been willing to address forthrightly.
There's no end to the number of articles that are being published, I think, especially about Harvard at this moment. Harvard is being absolutely eviscerated.
Because they actually stood up, right? The more recent president has not simply, kowtowed to Trump's demands as some other universities like Columbia have. And I think that's why. How dare they actually have a backbone in standing up for some of their policies and procedures.
Yeah. At the same time, I think there's also some articles out there coming from within Harvard critical of the way Harvard has run itself. And people have felt there are many policies at institutions, not just Harvard, that have been rather coercive, politically coercive.
And also perhaps being not so strict as things like plagiarism of former faculty and staff.
And former presidents
yeah,
of
exactly.
Harvard, even. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's all sorts of issues out there. And each one of these things in itself isn't so bad, but you take them collectively and for years on end. And I think I can start to see why people don't trust higher ed as maybe they once did. I think we need to work collectively to try to restore some
But
of that
also, there's a
trust.
lot of there's many critiques you could levy against how police departments are run. Old boys networks, which kind of overlook a lot of their corruption. But I think what we are professors, so it makes more sense for people of their institution to critique it. But also, that's kind of our calling card, right? Our calling card is willing to be critical, and so all the more important it is for us to be critical of the institution that we are a part of.
Absolutely. And you bring up a good point about policing and police institutions, right? There's plenty to critique there, and we would be remiss if we didn't critique them in the same way, right? We have to do that with ourselves here, right? Rather than wait. The danger is that you wait for someone else to do it, and they come in seeking to dismantle your institution.
Right, and might not appreciate some of the nuance in some of those critiques. So let's evaluate how we've accomplished our goals. So our goals basically set out was to kind of communicate life in academia and what are some of the issues that we're struggling with. And so I guess we can address both our own successes and shortcomings for our season. I think we were quite successful on raising a large diversity of issues with interesting, diverse guests. I think we've talked a lot about self-censorship, and while we both don't think we self-censored ourselves so much during our conversations, we have to admit that some of the more polarizing topics we have avoided bringing up because they might be too contentious to first when you're first introducing yourself as a podcast. And that's one of the things we struggled with is how much how much do you want to be honest because you just entered the fray, right? And do you want to risk being too polarizing with certain points of views because you can turn off listeners too quickly? But also, if you just kind of are mainstream milquetoast about things, and you don't actually kind of inspire and foster debates and discussions because you're just kind of taking a boring mainstream line. And so that's that kind of thing we've navigated, which I think I'd like to think we navigated some success. We really look forward to comments about that regard.
I agree with what you just said, Jeremy, and I think looking to season 2, we should try to push the boundaries a little bit more. I think even invite guests who have a greater diversity of views, who are willing to take a little bit more of a controversial stand, or maybe have had something of a controversial past, and maybe they've approached one of these social boundaries within academia. I would really like to hear more personal stories. Looking back at season 1, my favorite episodes were the ones where we had guests on. I really loved hearing about Alex's youth in Romania. It was great fun talking to Deborah and Jeff about their views on AI and how they see AI being used and the pitfalls and dangers of AI. And then later in the season, talking to our student guests about their experiences there.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we also debate is to what extent should we just basically provide a welcoming place for people to share their views, and to what extent should we be, critiques, pushing back on things, which, and again, neither of us found any of our guests said to be particularly objectionable, but, there's always rooms to push back on claims, and that's one of the things we've navigated is to what extent do we want to have this to be a rigorous intellectual thing, or to what extent is really more just about, allowing people to have a place where they can air views, and with the understanding, if anything objectionable emerged, we can certainly challenge it as it emerges.
Absolutely. I think there's a balance to be struck there between letting a conversation flow and letting people share their ideas and their experiences without interruption and trying to hold them accountable and pin them down on things. But I think anytime you do anything like a podcasting or journalism of any kind, there's also an obligation to try to reveal the truth and to identify the factual basis of claims. And I think we could do a little bit better job about that. I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit. This isn't meant to critique the students in particular, but I think one thing that comes to mind from our interview with the students recently was that there was a claim made in there that something like 90% of the work that was handed in, according to this student, was generated with AI. And that's not unbelievable, but it is a little bit of, I don't want to say even an extreme claim, because we read a lot about this in the media. But that's the kind of claim that, looking back on it, I wish I had probed just a little bit more. How do you know this? Is this something that you've seen, like you've seen other students using it in the work, or you've learned about this through conversation, or you kind of infer it based upon
A gut impression.
kind of a gut impression, or from what you've read of maybe other students' works?
With 90% just being a proxy for I see it all the time. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think, in general, that's kind of one of my personal goals going forward into season 2, is to try to ask some more probing questions here and there.
What else did you find went well or could be done differently for the season?
I don't know if overall I see any trends of things that we could do much better, other than I think we just need to continue to expand the range of topics that we're investigating. On a personal note, I think I can look back at things that I said, and here and there I edited out things. I think, we did, and our guests did also, and I think that's fair. Looking back at some of the things I've said, I can see places where I dropped comments and thoughts and moved on too quickly. For example, in one of the earlier podcasts, I was saying something about how students are making decisions to go to college now based upon career earning. And what you see when you look at the majors is that anything with math tends to be highest earning. And then you have the humanities in the middle, and then down at the bottom, you have art. And I left that comment there unexplained. And I think, taken at face value, that might seem like I was criticizing art as a discipline. And that really was not the intention at all. The intention was really just to make a connection to how students are making decisions, especially in regard to college.
Right, and also because how much money you would earn is not at all an indication of the value of something to society.
Absolutely.
Or value.
If you love art and have a passion for it, you should absolutely go do that. I think, but in all decisions that we make, we have to be also aware of the costs and benefits, and there might be financial costs to some of these decisions about what we choose to study. But I think, the point is, left at face value, that comment, I think, could have been interpreted incorrectly or different than I had intended. And I think this is something that we just need to be aware of, especially when we drop statements and then move on to a new idea, which is very easy to do in a conversation that bounces around.
And that's, I think, one of the trickier things about having a podcast as professors in academia is, we are always aware about the importance of nuance and, the importance of mentioning all the ways in which there are exceptions to what you're saying, and how sometimes it's actually very difficult to communicate. I think that's why a lot of people sometimes don't like listening to professors, is because we can't speak as directly, because, of course, when you make a simple statement that usually doesn't apply, there's all sorts of exceptions that apply to it, and you need the time to be able to explain those nuances, and hopefully people give you the benefit of the doubt that you've thought about those nuances, but you also, for the ease of communication, you sometimes have to just make statements and then move on. But I think that's a challenge all professors face, is that balance between having a conversation flow versus taking time to kind of give every nuance, exception, and clarification to any statement we make, which might help protect ourselves from critiques, but of course also makes I would imagine a lot of people less interested in hearing us speak.
Absolutely right. A 20-minute conversation could turn into a 3-hour conversation quite easily. I think that one of the dangers there also is that we, or not just with academics, but I think in life in general, you can easily get caught up by worrying too much about what other people think and how they might think poorly of what you say. To me, the answer there is, or the appropriate response is, not to be paranoid and walking on eggshells about what you say. The point, rather, is to speak your mind. And if someone has a disagreement, they should speak their disagreement back to us. Example, drop a comment in the show notes here, and then we can continue the dialogue, right? And these points of disagreement can be fleshed out with further conversation. Again, this gets back to our earlier point. What we need is more conversation, not less.
Right, and I remember this was, I mentioned in an earlier episode how my thoughts on COVID and our responses to COVID were quite divergent from my colleagues. And because of that sense of like challenging the status quo perception of COVID University led to a lot of viewpoints not being mentioned, led to a lot of students' perspectives being marginalized, because a lot of students had very different ideas about being forced to get a vaccine, especially if they're 18 years old and healthy. The vaccines are much better targeted towards people with multiple morbidities and older, et cetera. So I think that, that when that culture of fear about alienating your colleagues when you have a view that is unorthodox or differs to a significant degree, or even sometimes to a minor degree to what might be considered consensus, also doesn't allow people to know those viewpoints. Things like they might believe they have a really outlier viewpoint, but it's really because of the self-censorship of divergent views that in fact there might be more nuance along a spectrum of ideas than one might otherwise perceive.
So here's an idea. Looking ahead to season 2, are there particular things that along these lines that you think are controversial that we should speak about in season 2, or things that you would like to speak about but aren't even yet ready to do so?
Ooh, those are two very different questions.
Okay.
Should and so yeah, whether or not this gets aired, we'll see. But I was once a guest on a podcast where I was asked to speak about environmental issues and environmental education and things like that. And I had listened to the guest previous to me, and I, respect this guest's views, and he was also talking about environmental issues. So I just kind of thought, I don't think all their guests talk about environmental things, but, I listened to the previous guests and, was very much on the same page. So, yeah, I have no issue. I shared my views, and it was a whole conversation just about the environment. Then, the podcast wasn't actually released to some weeks later. Then I got all this hate mail one morning, about a particular issue that I did not speak about at all. But the hate mail was in regard to the fact that I was willing to go on a podcast in which some previous guest from weeks or months past had raised a very controversial issue, right? And so the hate mail was in regard that I should have vetoed even being on the show, despite the fact that I did not even talk about the issue that I was being sent hate mail about. So it's those kind of experiences, which has made me hesitant to even talk about some issues because of how deeply polarizing they are.
Talk about a chilling effect. There was kind of an attempt or an intimidation towards cancellation based upon not what you said, but your general affiliation with someone who knew someone.
Right. We shared a podcast space separated by weeks or months, and that was enough for an attempt to intimidate me to be canceled.
Yeah. Cancel culture in general is run amok, and I think it kind of got a foothold in academia at times.
But that's what I think is really unique about this time to have a podcast about higher ed, because I think for the past few years, largely the issues of cancel culture was being canceled from the left. It's right, not being woke enough on a variety of issues. But I think now we're actually at this convergence where with the Trump administration, now it's the cancellation from the right, which has actually arguably much more serious consequences, right? It's not a matter of people not liking you or not wanting to attend your presentation or people trolling you negative comments, but it's actually you can end up getting deported, for example, if you...
Certainly for foreign students and faculty members, getting deported is a huge cost. I think we shouldn't diminish the personal costs that some people have suffered from cancel culture on the left. Losing your job for saying something that someone viewed as insensitive or not politically correct or whatever, that's a huge hit. And that happened quite a lot for a period. In the varying degrees. Losing your job is probably the worst thing that could happen, but certainly your reputation can take a hit. People were uninvited from conferences, from speaking invitations at other institutions for things that they had said that touched upon political issues.
Right, and those sort of cancellations only embolden those attacking from the right, such that that's kind of added to that climate of not being comfortable to discuss these things.
And I think there's a fair point there. I think higher ed was heading down a path in this sense that was not healthy, and some kind of reckoning was needed. And the reckoning has come, and it's come with greater force than I think anyone anticipated that it would. I think now is the time to try to find the middle ground between these two competing forces.
Right. For a little bit of a humor, I'm going to play a little clip from one of my favorite scholars, Aboriginal scholar Tyson Yunkaporta, talking about his own experience of being canceled from the left and the right.
I've been cancelled a few times from the left, and from the right, but I would prefer to be cancelled by the left. The left, it's an ad hominem attack, and it's like, you're this and that, and, we don't like you. If you're going to speak at this event, I'm not coming. Like, that's the worst you're going to get. From the right, it's you are Satan, and I am going to kill you. And it's not just a few people, and they know how to call out these crazies. They're feeding them red meat all the time, and they got them ready to roll. If you get cancelled from the right, your life is in danger. You get cancelled from the left, then, I don't know, someone with blue hair is going to annoy you. I don't think you're really being cancelled.
So what are your thoughts on that assessment?
I wonder if things are changing. It was just today in the news I heard about two, like a young Jewish couple that was shot, it was basically assassinated by some radical person that when they were arrested was shouting "Free Palestine." There was 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump last year. I wonder if what was typically the violence
of right-wing extremists is now sort of,
is broadening.
And I think where we would both agree is that inability to have conversations by people of divergent views only makes these extremists more likely, right? Because people don't feel heard. People don't have opportunities to find common ground. Of course, tech algorithms and tech companies contribute to this further, right? They are very well aware that more people stay engaged as they have their views validated and not have their views challenged. And so I think tech companies have a very large onus of the responsibility of this further polarization. But of course, all of us who are engaged in these discussions, we can do our part to kind of mitigate the tech companies' complete unwillingness to care about this because it interferes with profit, their companies, right? So, and that's what we hope to be doing here.
And I think as individuals, there's 2 things that we can do to push back against this social trend. One is to just listen, right?
Yeah.
Really listen to what a person is saying. And in the process of listening, try to understand, come in with the assumption that they're a good person and that they're coming in with a different experience and maybe a different set of values, right? And that understanding that entire picture, their thoughts, their experiences, their values, is necessary for understanding. And
where students feel they can't express their views in a college setting would very much be an indictment of higher education if they are not able to provide that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then after we've done that active listening exercise where we really try to understand another person's view, when we move into discussion, I think the other almost emotional state that we need to bring into the conversation is that I don't think we should enter a discussion with the intention to change minds. I think if you do that necessarily leads to a form of aggression. Like, what we really need to do is just sit down and have a conversation, and I let you have your thoughts and you let me have mine. And if we leave the conversation not agreeing or even feeling more affirmed in our individual perspectives, that's just the way it is. Right? And we can't, I think there's a sense of righteousness that people on the left and the right have. And they feel that their view is so right that if they explain it to someone else, that person should come around to their view.
Right. Reason prevails. Clearly, they'll see my view if the facts are laid out. Yeah.
Exactly. And if they don't, they're a terrible person.
And of course, and this is the downside to just having discussions without this open-mindedness because of reactive attitudes. If you engage in a conversation where you're not genuinely open to assume the person has good intentions and, is willing to consider other points of view, you can end up polarizing the point of view and making someone's views even stronger. So dialogue is important, but dialogue has to be engaged with this open-minded spirit. Otherwise, it might actually be worse to engage in the dialogue.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Attacking someone, the fellow you played the clip from a moment ago talked about the ad hominem attacks, and that's the worst that you get. Yeah, but there are serious consequences to that. Like attacking a person individually, trying to tarnish their reputation, actually has pretty intense consequences, right? That person is going to most likely having felt attacked, probably going to try to kind of fortify their position. Maybe they're going to seek out people who are more like-minded and form a network and kind of, in a sense, recede from your perspective even further.
Right.
I have a thought here. I'm curious, maybe as an exercise along these lines, without even talking about the thing itself, could we even just make a list of things that are controversial or perhaps even toxic to talk about in academia? Can we even say that?
I think that is a place we can go. So we could take turns.
Let's take turns. You want me to start?
Sure. I think the perspectives of gender identity is a topic I think most avoid unless they are pre-assured the people they're speaking with share their view.
Right. In private conversations, away from the classroom, away from anything public. Yeah. I think DEI issues are one that many people avoid talking about, and there's kind of an assumption on campus that everyone does and should agree with DEI philosophy.
Population, I think, is another topic. Specifically, what some call overpopulation. Now, admittedly, there is a large racist history with regard to, rich countries lecturing countries in Africa and Asia about their population while doing nothing to control their own. There's, right-wing shooters who have, racist manifestos about certain people having too many children. But I think in general that does a disservice to the fact that there's 8 billion people trying to pursue or currently pursuing middle-class lifestyles that a planet can't support. And I think that's actually anytime you raise the population specter, you're very likely to be labeled a racist. And that means most people who discuss environmentalism tend to shy away from discussing issues of population.
I think another one that people are reluctant to wade into is an open discussion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And there's lots of protests against Israel. I don't hear on college campuses, I don't hear a lot of defense of Israel on college campuses. I know those voices exist, but the louder voices at this moment, I think, are the pro-Palestinian voices.
Yes, although at the same time, there's much higher consequences to being a pro-Palestinian student or perspective, as has happened in the past few months, people spending weeks or months in jail just for expressing those views. So, but yeah, I think
I'm not saying that that's right, but
Right.
I think people have been reluctant to come out in defense of Israel in these times.
let's see what else.
I'll throw in one more.
Sure.
I think climate change skepticism, or anyway, I think the people are reluctant to discuss their general skepticism of climate modeling predictions in general, right? There's a lot of nuance, a lot of details, a lot of modeling that happens there. I think, and this isn't one that's highly controversial, but I think people tend to just accept the status quo, right? That climate change is happening. And to me, it's not so obvious. I think we talked about this. Well, the podcast we just put out last week kind of explored some of these ideas. And I think there's there's room to get into serious debate about these issues. Climate models are complex enough with highly nonlinear feedbacks that we don't really know what the long-term state is going to be.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, where else do I feel I can't say certain things? So this isn't really so much of a censorship issue, but the classic default view is that the professor that lectures is bad pedagogy, right? That it should always only be fostering group discussions and group work and student participation, student engagement. That anytime a professor gives more than a 5-minute talk, it's automatically bad pedagogy, right? But I think that's kind of not accurate. I think there's a lot of role to storytelling. That some professors can be very effective storytellers, and there's cultures of oral traditions where people can speak for hours. And in fact, in many ways, by not engaging in longer discussions, it actually helps contribute to the inability of people to pay attention, right? Because they're not actually being challenged to. Now, to be fair, I think if you're simply throwing on slides and speaking, without any interruption in an attempt to engage your audience, and you don't update your slides, right? Yeah, there's high variability in the effectiveness of an extended lecture, but it's not automatically a terrible thing. But in education circles, you often have to kind of default assume that it is terrible and that you would never do that.
It sounds like we're missing some nuance there. I mean, that person who puts up their slides and reads from the slides for 60 minutes to the class, that person also wouldn't be regarded as a good storyteller.
Right, yeah.
I would like to see more discussion of more traditional forms of teaching and more traditional values of teaching. I'm not associated with education philosophy directly in education courses, so maybe you know about this, but I tend to think that some of the older ways of teaching, emphasizing rigor and drilling exercises, things like this, are really important, and they've become kind of passé in our modern culture. I don't think they're respected, especially in education circles. I think they actually have high value for students that are trying to learn skills. Can you imagine taking a martial arts class and not drilling endlessly to learn your forms? Right? That aspect of drilling is inherent in almost everything else we do, playing a musical instrument, sports, like artistic endeavors, throwing pottery, throwing clay on a wheel, right? Like you have to do it time and time again to get it right. Yet when it comes to education, the idea of drilling seems like, we're tormenting students or something there. That I honestly have a hard time understanding and respecting, actually.
Well, I would even take tradition even back further, because if I think about indigenous, communities and how they've generally engaged in education, is before a child's rite of passage, children were essentially allowed to do what they wanted, study what they want, whatever is interesting to them. And the idea that then when students are allowed to and encouraged to pursue the things that interest them, they're going to engage in deep learning. And later on in their life, when they've found the things that they care to specialize or become experts in, whether that's hunting or native medicine or healing or whatever, later on they can work with apprentices to kind of have those kind of deep, intense, longer skills. But so yeah, in terms of tradition, I would even take it back pre-industrial, pre-agricultural, and what we've lost by allowing children to explore. And I think we're slowly, education scholars are starting to pick up on that, on what was lost by all this early drilling, as opposed to the kind of creative free expression of students, children. Oh, and I thought of another topic, drug use. I think it's interesting. I think back in the 70s, professors have told me that at the time they could not only speak openly about drug use, but regularly engage in drug use with their students. Now, I'm not advocating that, but I think it's interesting that in general, there's an understanding that if the drug is legal, it's acceptable to talk about, but if the drug is illegal, then it is verboten. And you have this interesting thing where I think much research has spoken about the value of psychedelics for long-term healing of trauma, for expanding your mind, of processing death, of opening your tolerance and your openness to new experiences has been kind of shut down or looked down upon because it's actually legal. But then other drugs that are legal, like coffee, I think about how freely everyone can talk about their coffee addictions with no problem because it's legal. And it's like, oh yeah, I couldn't possibly survive without coffee in the morning. And that's completely acceptable discourse because it's legal. And so this conflation of the value and benefit drugs with their temporary legal or illegal status, I think it tends to also shut down valuable conversations, both of the benefits and the critiques of drugs that are legal and illegal.
Another topic that I think won't have much appeal to people outside academia, but those inside academia will immediately know what I'm talking about, are things like the course teacher evaluation. I think there's a ton of pretending that these things are meaningful, and everyone knows they're largely bullshit, and they're used all over the place, and we're not having an honest conversation about what is actually going on with CTEs. And things like the correlation between CTE scores and grades, and that there's a fact of, in some sense, there's a quid pro quo, an unspoken agreement between student and teacher. Right? Good grades beget good CTE scores.
Yeah, which is a phenomenon. Well, I think obviously there are two professors that, quote, give good grades. One of them could be simply giving out A's for no effort, and the other one could be demanding a lot of rigor, but helping the students along to get those A's, right? But yeah, certainly you can't deny that correlation exists, and it provides a disincentive to provide adequate rigor, and of course, collectively tends to lead to grade inflation.
And also, I want to be clear, I don't mean that anyone who has high CTE scores is implicitly a terrible teacher or anything like that. It's not as simple as that. It's not like you have to, the answer is to invert the entire structure. But I think it's just, we pretend many times that the meaning of CTEs is simple when in fact it's actually terribly complicated, and the meaning, there's in many cases very little meaning to these things.
Well, and the meaning is that increasingly as colleges become consumer environments, where it's so important for your enrollment to meet your tuition targets, that you need to please your consumers. And one of the ways you please your consumers is higher grades. So they're meaningful to the extent that there's this added institutional pressure to boost grades to keep your customer base happy.
Other topics that are controversial?
Actually, it's not so much that we can't speak about this, but that we don't. And that is narcissism. I think so much of academia incentivizes narcissism. I think narcissists thrive in academic settings. I think it's more common the higher up you go in elite universities. But, what do we have to do at the end of every year? We have to basically talk about how great we are. Here's all the things we've published. Here's all the presentations we've given. Here's our new innovative teacher. It's in multiple venues, right? There's like the official university report, then there's your CV, then there's your promotion portfolio, right? So like it's a whole culture which is all about self-promotion, and there's very little critique of individuals within the institutions who are clearly narcissists, right? Who are clearly driven by status, and in some cases actually can be effective professors, because as narcissists, they really, it's important that other people have a high view of them, so they might actually invest a lot into their teaching so that they have this positive reputation, but of course at the expense of their colleagues, about the nightmare conditions of work they create on their colleagues, because they're extremely manipulative, right? And they know how to play people against each other and backstab and drag people down. And I don't think there's ever a discussion about how the very institution of academia incentivizes narcissism, and therefore we have to be ever vigilant of it and point it out when we see it.
Interesting. Yeah, I would feel pointing it out when we see it. That's you've bitten off quite a task for yourself there, Jeremy. Relating to again, to the classroom environment, I think another topic, we've touched upon this a bit, but I think it's one that teachers are reluctant to discuss, is the decline in skills of our students coming into our classrooms, reading skills, math skills, basic kind of student life skills, like how to focus, how to be diligent in your work and responsible. And so we're seeing a change, a cultural change that is in many ways unhealthy. And I think people talk about this stuff privately, but people are reluctant to speak openly about the changes that we see, the problems that we see. And I don't think sometimes I think as professors, we can feel very alone.
I do think we are speaking about it a lot in privately, like you say. So it's not like we're censoring many of our observations of this. But I think what is lacking is any kind of collective joint effort of how to address it, right? And some of it might be because it could be perceived that it can't be addressed, right? Because these things are really systemic, the TikTokification of youth, right? That a lot of this could be forces driven by the fact that, you can't actually speak for 20 minutes, or you have to be a particularly effective storyteller to keep people engaged for 20 minutes because of how, social media has just kind of rewired the brain to make the inability to focus. So I feel like I am regularly hearing colleagues comment on this phenomenon, but then there's no kind of like concern, okay, let's all talk about what this means and can we address it? If so, how can we address it, like on the systemic level in our own classes as an institution, right? So I'd say that second part is the piece.
I agree with that completely. Yes, yeah. We're missing an institutional conversation about such things.
Yeah. So, in thinking of the retrospective of our podcast, we talk about things we could have done better, things we could have done differently. Overall, I have to say it's been a very enjoyable process.
Absolutely.
I very much look forward to our once-a-week evening meetups. It's kind of just great to be able to have a productive output tied to these conversations, because I think originally we were just having great conversations all the time, and we're just like, hey, we should probably record this, and now we've kind of like make it a little more streamlined with a topic, at least try to stay on the topic. But I find that academia could actually be often very stifling of creativity, right? Like even academic writing is often so dry and formulaic and overuses the passive voice, and so just to be able to do a creative endeavor like this has been a great joy.
Absolutely, I echo your thoughts there. I've had a great time doing this. I appreciate the collaborative spirit that we've established here. I think we complement each other very nicely. One of the things that you and I would both like to try to elicit in our guests is a little bit more of a discussion of their personal experience and voyage through academia. And so taking time to do that would be great. In that sense, also reaching out to people from a very diverse audience across the country, internationally, would be great.
But it's also an issue of comfort, right? Because I think many professors especially are very comfortable talking about intellectual issues and talking about their ideas, but talking about personal experiences of vulnerability, of marginalization, of loneliness, that's a higher bar that for people to comfortably share with people they don't know on a podcast, but I think would be very rich. And I think one of the things we can develop is our skill set is how can we foster an environment where people feel comfortable being vulnerable to whatever degree they're willing to be vulnerable, to kind of get that insight into the experience beyond just the intellectual.
And I think one of the best ways we can do that is by modeling that ourselves.
Right.
Maybe in that spirit, I'm going to share a thought and a recent experience of mine. The end of the semester for us came last week. Last Friday was the last day of finals. And it was just a mad dash for me all the way up to the end. And then immediately after that, I started working on research stuff that I'd been neglecting. But as the end of the semester approached, I felt a sense of depression coming over me. For those of us that love our work, we put so much energy and so much of ourselves into our work. When that vanishes and the students go home, all of a sudden our lives feel very empty and lonely.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like...
You're forced to address the void that you were suppressing with all the busyness all semester.
Yeah, well, right. And so that also leaves you with a lot of time for personal reflection about your life, good or for bad, right? And what you have left over outside of school, which is in many ways a distraction from our personal lives as well. It reminds me a little bit about you and I have both gone to Burning Man. Do you remember people talking about having to return to the default world after Burning Man?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that decompression. They even have like events. I know in the Bay Area, they have these events that are kind of
Post-Burning
like
Man events.
Yeah, they're like decompression events to gradually transition back to society.
Right. It kind of, I feel like the semester for me is like a Burning Man event, and I live in this alternate reality that's exciting and interesting. And then when the end of the semester hits, it's like a little bit of a return to the boring and the normal default world.
I would be certainly willing to share vulnerable things, but I have to admit I was on sabbatical this past year, so it's been quite the dream life of travel and conducting research in other places. But yeah, for sure, I don't know any professor who would be willing to say that there are many aspects of their job which don't cause great depression and or anxiety.
Anxiety,
from time to time.
hugely. Yeah.
And the anxiety, of course, are these pressures of what's happening in higher ed about like uncertain futures, uncertain future funding. You know, we're all dealing with like budget cuts and people to varying degrees worried about their program disappearing. And then on top of that, what's happening with the Trump administration and all the concerns about what that means for the future of higher ed. Take that what happened with student engagement and student present and lack of lowering enrollment. Like, yeah, there's a constant struggle to, I think many of us get a lot of meaning out of our work we do as professors, and it can be a really soul crushing when, you know, for example, you put a lot into a lesson and it just totally flops, right? And there's not that interest or engagement there was, or the lesson worked great last year and you walked in excited to do it again, and for, you know, a totally different student dynamic, you know, it flops, and it's like, you know, you're an adult in your 40s and you're devastated by how, you know, students reacted or didn't react to a particular lesson. So yeah, I think there's a lot of that. But yeah, this is those professors lucky enough to be in a tenure track position that have a sabbatical do get this very recharging respite once every 7 years, which I'm very grateful for.
We're at interesting crossroads. You're returning to teaching, and I am in the process of departing from my normal teaching duties next fall.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to say if we listen to the podcast next season and we see greater stress in me and less stress in you, if viewers can perceive that, right? Because to be fair, we've come at this from very different angles, right? Eric is constantly busy, and I have to work around his schedule, and happy to because I'm on sabbatical, and that will flip next season.
Maybe last thing I'll share for the night is that I took time today to look at my CTEs. So for those of you who don't know what this means, that means course teacher evaluation. It goes under different names at different institutions, but it's basically the student ranking of effectively and mainly the professor and their teaching. It's also supposed to be about the course design kind of more generally, but really it's about the student's connection and like of the professor. And I put a lot of energy into a course that I taught. It was the second time that I taught it, and really tried to make it a great experience. And I had a great time. And the one comment that I got from in the responses there was, worst class I've ever had.
Wow.
Yeah, it's deflating. It's demoralizing. I shouldn't say it's demoralizing. It's not unexpected. Actually, I know, again, as we were talking earlier, as I mentioned my comments on CTs, I push my students hard. And I know, you know, they don't like that. I think they're better for it, and they will be better for it in the long run. So, you know, it's one of those character building experiences for them. And they need not like me. And it's one of those things that maybe 10 years from now, they might have an inkling that what I did for them was a good thing. And that's okay. You know, I'm okay with those kinds of comments, but it's still deflating in the moment.
Well, in many ways, CTEs are like a character building exercise for us, because I think even like when I've had comments, like one particular semester, I I assigned, I think, 3 things that I wrote, 3 articles, and my reasoning was like, well, not only are they relevant, but like, oh, they get to see insight into like, I wrote this, so if you want to ask me how I collected the data, like what did I omit, you know, I'm happy to respond to your critiques. And I think like 3 students wrote like, you know, like the professor signs too much of their own work. Like,
He's such a narcissist.
yeah, such a narcissist. Oh, they didn't say the word narcissist, but it's totally how I perceived it. And it's interesting that, like, if you ask different professors you find they have all sorts of rituals involved with the unveiling and the reading of the CTEs. Some, like, you know, are feverishly pressing refresh to get the data as soon as possible because our school doesn't let you get your CTEs until after you've submitted your grades. Some have, like, I won't check them for 2 weeks after, or I won't check at the end of the summer. Some professors never check them at all, and some professors are more casual about it. You know, like, oh, maybe if I'll check them if I happen. So, but it's interesting that a lot of professors, even if they don't think about themselves as being highly impacted by the CTEs, they actually have these prescribed rituals for how they'll handle the unveiling of what was said about them.
It kind of caught me off guard, but it was also a good reminder to myself today that I think the best way to be, as much as possible, detached from other people's thoughts and opinions of yourself, and to follow your own conscience and intuition.
Yeah, and to always take feedback as chance for improvement, but as a balancing act between like what is a legitimate critique of something I can improve and what if it is just a personal gripe because they didn't care for our perspective or our standards.
I think one can feel very trapped and confined when you start caring and seeking the approval of others.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's it's a difficult thing to step away from, but I think once you do it, it's better.
Yeah. I think what a lot of the issues we're raising on this podcast and will continue to raise, clearly we're treading the right light there about being less concerned about what colleagues might think about us.
I think it will be a very interesting experiment to see what people say or don't say to us as time goes on.
Yes, and please, for any colleagues at our institution or elsewhere listening to this, please, we would love to hear your thoughts privately, publicly, as per your preference. Yeah. But this is the point of this is dialogue. So please feel free to disagree, express more nuance to statements we've made, and we'd like to have this to be an ongoing conversation.
And I'd say one other thought to build upon that. We definitely want the conversation, and I think everyone has an interesting story to tell. Yes. And if you think that you have something that you would like to share on a podcast, drop us a note. You know, I think we're looking for guests. We've loved having our guests on this first season, and we're going to do more of that in season 2.
So thanks again to all our guests who took the time in their busy schedules to share their thoughts with us. And here's looking forward to season 2, brother.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jeremy. It's been a great season.
Eric, the pleasure's all mine.
Good night, everyone.